Welcome to Activity 4 in the Music Math module, Discovering Music Fractions. Varying the number of beats in a 4-count pattern can make a more interesting musical piece. In this activity, students will build upon their knowledge so far to create even more complicated pieces of music and represent it so that others can play it as well. Moreover, students will have real-world examples of using parts of a whole. They will discover fractions through the lens of music. They will use fractional notation and practice adding fractions to create a whole. Let's start with the materials you'll need for this activity. 8-inch squares of paper in various colors, scissors, glue or glue sticks, clothesline or twine, clothespins or paper clips, yarn, note values chart. You can find this chart on page MM13 of the Changing the Equation curriculum. In preparation for this activity, string a clothesline or twine across the room along with plenty of clothespins or paper clips. So let's get started. Discovering musical fractions. This activity is broken down into 5 steps, cumulatively taking about an hour and 20 minutes. Step 1. Introduction. This should take about 5 minutes. In this activity, students will look at another way to create compositions based on the length of time allowed for each sound. Tell students that they're going to find a way to indicate how long they want each sound to last. In this activity, the 8-inch squares are not just worth 1 beat, they're worth a whole 4 beats, an entire measure. Let's see how we can divide that measure into different beats to create different musical patterns. Remind students that they have been creating 4-count measures and that each count was represented by a sound that was of equal duration. Ask them to think about the music they like. Take a few examples. Point out how some sounds in these songs are longer and some are shorter. Step 2. Demonstration. This should take you about 15 minutes. Show your students one of the 8-inch squares you have been using to represent beats and explain that it represents a 4-count measure. Fold that paper in half and then in half again so that it's divided into 4 smaller squares. Cut these squares apart and hang them on a piece of twine you have strung earlier using clothespins and paper clips. Drape a piece of yarn on either side of the 4 pieces to show the beginning and end of the measure. Each square represents one of the sounds in the 4-count measure. Have a short discussion. If we know that the 4-count measure, 8-inch square, is a whole, what part of a whole does each of these small squares represent? How can we write that? Help students discover they can write a mathematical equation. 1 equals 1/4 plus 1/4 plus 1/4 plus 1/4. How could you indicate that you want a sound, like a clap, to be 2 quick sounds? They could divide one of these squares into 2 pieces. If we further divide one of these pieces into 2, what will each of these represent? One way to think about this is to figure out how many of these small rectangles it will take to cover the original 8-inch square. Since it takes 8, each portion is 1/8 of a whole. For older students, you can even explain that 1/4 divided by 2 is 1/8. Now have your students even further divide these notes. Have them cut a 1/8 piece in half. What part of a whole does this represent now? 1/8 divided by 2 is 1/16. Students can now use these smaller pieces, 1/4, 1/8, and 1/16, to show sound length. Suggest a color code, like red equals clap, blue equals stomp, and yellow equals snap, to indicate which sound is being used. Try having your class determine this code and post it in a prominent place so that students can refer to it as they work in their small groups. Step 3. Discovering musical fractions. This should take you about 20 minutes. Pass out copies of the note value chart. Draw your class's attention to the fraction graphic on the chart and discuss how the lengths of the notes are like fractions. For example, 2 half notes are equal to a whole note, and 4 eighth notes are equal to 1 half note, and so on. You could say that a 1/4 note is a regular run-of-the-mill clap, and a 1/8 note indicates a quick clap, like this. This might be hard for your students to imagine, so practice with them. Step 4. Small group activity. Split your class again into music groups, and try to find new ways to construct your 4-count measure. Remember that the total for each of your measures will be equal to the large 8-inch square. Have each group create a measure that uses a variety of different note lengths and sounds, and represent that musical pattern with colored squares that correspond to the code you created as a class. Ask questions like, what combinations did you use for your measure? How else could you arrange them? Is there a combination you like better than another? Why is that? For older students, you can have them write up their musical notes as a fraction sequence that proves each measure is equal to one whole. For example, 4/8 plus 1/2 equals one whole. Step 5. Large group activity. This should take about 20 minutes. Have each group perform their 2 measures, then hang them up on the clothesline for everyone to see. As an extension, you can have your entire class rearrange their measures to create a larger piece of music. There are plenty of ways to continue this, but give each group time to perform and have the class ask questions as well. Have them explain their thoughts to the rest of the class. How did they create their music? What kind of music do they like? How does the music they create emulate the music that they like?
Changing the equation. After-school math curriculum brought to you by Explora. Funding provided by Sandia National Laboratories. Find more Changing the Equation videos at explora.us/changing-the-equation.